Some stories don't whisper, they howl. They echo through the corridors of adolescence, daring readers to face truth, power, and transformation. The author we're featuring today crafts those kinds of stories, whether it's fierce feminist reimagining of Red Hood, the quiet heartbreak of What Girls Are Made Of, or the emotional unraveling of Damsel. Her books don't flinch. They've been celebrated with awards and honors, and they've also been faced with bans and challenges for their honesty. She writes with a voice that is tender as it is ferocious, and through her work, she is becoming a leading force in the fight for the freedom to read. Please welcome the fearless Elana K. Arnold.
Hello, that was a very generous introduction. I appreciate it so much. It's so nice to be here. I don't know about fearless, but what are you going to do? I'm here.
Were there any childhood books or authors that inspired you to become a writer?
So when I was a kid, I more than any specific book was granted the honor and respect by my grandmother of complete freedom. She had a library in her house, which was basically just a spare bedroom where the closet doors had been taken off, and my grandfather had built in bookshelves, and they were floor to ceiling full of just a complete mismatch of books, and nothing was off limits. I was, just no one ever told me I could or couldn't read anything. It was just books were books. Books were for everyone. Books were for exploring. And I read voraciously. Oftentimes, I had no idea what I was reading. Um, I read, all of the mysteries from Agatha Christie over and over again. I read The Thorn Birds. I remember reading everything you ever wanted to know about sex, but were afraid to ask when I was in middle school. It was a, eye-opening book that hopefully they've updated some in the last 20 years. But I read Mein Kampf, which my Jewish grandmother had a copy of on her bookshelf. Um, I read it, I just read. And so I think more than any specific book, it was that, you know, just access to everything and sort of a respectful trust that if I had questions, I'd ask them. And if I found something that made me, uncomfortable, I'd put it down and come back to it later that, probably underlies my whole sort of connection to literature.
So not a lot of kids, usually read like Mein Kampf. So what
Yeah.
was your initial reaction to learning about, World War II so early on?
Well, I'd learned about it before that. We're Jewish, and my grandparents are both Holocaust survivors. My most recent young adult novel is called The Blood Years, and it's a historical fiction based on my grandmother's teenage years in Chernovitz, Romania, before and during the Holocaust. So I can't remember a time when I didn't know about the Holocaust. And that's true about like any person who's raised by people who have been marginalized or endangered in one way or another, Black kids grow up always knowing, that they don't have necessarily all the same protections from the police here as their white friends. Probably Asian American kids who grew up here grew up knowing about, what happened to their grandparents here on the soil in World War II. So there wasn't a time I can't remember not knowing about the Holocaust. I thought it was very interesting that my Nana had a copy of Mein Kampf on her bookshelf. She bought it at a yard sale, like most things. And she just thought it was, important to know what people believe, even if maybe most especially if they don't agree with you. I didn't read the whole book. I thought it was kind of boring and confusing, but knowing it was there was, very interesting my whole life. I've always really loved that about my grandmother, that she was someone who, I don't know, she didn't have sort of limitations as far as access to information.
When you first found out that Red Hood, Damsel, and What Girls Are Made Of are being banned, what was your initial reaction? And did you anticipate that your work would be challenged in this way?
I didn't really think very much about it. My books were coming out. I mean, I'm not a bestseller, so a lot of my stuff, I'm more known now, but a lot of my stuff sort of flew under the radar for a long time. Not many people read my books, honestly. And so I was very lucky to have a publisher, and I still do, that supports me being creative and exploring the facets of the world that sort of fascinate, compel, titillate, and disgust me is kind of where my young adult work comes from. Um, the first couple times I heard about it, my shame reflex was triggered. I have a lot of sort of, uh, shame for a variety of reasons. And I remember, oh no, I'm in trouble, that feeling of being in trouble, which I hate so much. I don't have it so much anymore because I get so many notifications now about my books being banned. Um, so I guess my initial response was, fear, sort of fight, flight, fear, or fawn, freeze or fawn. I'm a freezer and a fawner. So that was my initial response, which I'm glad I don't have so much anymore, but it's only because it's been numbed through sort of almost countless repetition at this point.
Your books have sparked important discussions on censorship and free speech, especially now as one of the contributors to Band Together. Have there been any surprising reactions, either from supporters or critics, that made you see your work in a new light?
One thing that I don't know if it makes me see my work in a new light, but it maybe makes me see myself in my new light. I often hear people tell me that I'm brave, which I think is very funny because I'm not brave. I'm actually quite cowardly in many ways. But um, I write about the things that are interesting to me, and I write out of sort of a knowledge base that I have experienced personally. And for better and for worse, the sort of knowledge base of like early sexualization that I have to work from is not great. It's icky at best and criminal at worst. And so, and I don't think of myself as someone with a huge imagination. I don't make up whole worlds. I work from what I know. And if the world has filled you up with just waves of men sort of feeling entitled to your body, and then you go to write fiction, that's what you're going to pull from. You're going to pull from your base of knowledge. So then to hear people tell me that my stuff is, uh, you know, some people say brave. I say I'm not brave. I'm just using what I have. And some people say pornographic, and inappropriate. Again, I'm just using what I have, from my well of sort of young womanhood. So that's sort of been interesting to me to see the different ways different people think of me versus the way that I think of my own work, which is simply just me in my own little world, digging through my own little reservoir, making things that interest me, and that I hope will connect with other people. But I'm not a writer who starts with the reader. Um, I try not to think about the reader until like copy edits, like so far along, like, okay, that at that point I start to wonder. By then I know what I'm trying to say. I don't usually know when I start, So by then I'm like, okay, well, is what I'm saying here too much or not enough in order to connect best with the reader? But readers don't make it into my process until the very end. So um, I think I went off topic a little bit there, but mostly I'm just focused on, maybe it's because of the way my brain works. I know it's because of the way my brain works that I'm very sort of like my eyeballs are turned inward in when I'm doing a lot of my creative work.
Your books often tackle complex and sometimes uncomfortable topics, from gender dynamics to power and consent. But what drives you to explore these certain themes, and how do you balance honesty with sensitivity when writing for readers?
Yeah. So I don't think of myself as someone who writes from themes. So I don't explore themes, I don't think. In fact, the word theme, I think, is probably one of them, like one of those bright red flashing stop signs as a writer. I try very hard to stay away from identifying or interrogating thematic meaning of my books. I just try to tell a really good story. And it usually comes from me noticing something, either inside me or around me, and then asking, well, what if? Like with Red Hood, I came up with the idea for that book, which is about a cisgendered girl who, when she gets her period for the first time, finds that with her blood comes the ability to hunt and kill werewolves. I remember I was skiing, excuse me, I was ice skating with my family, and we were in the forest, and there was a full moon, and there were these big fir trees all around. And we're like kind of in the middle of nowhere, and I just begun my period. And I remember thinking, well, that's interesting. Like I'm cycling with the moon, this full moon, and werewolves cycle with the moon. And so it was me noticing that and then saying, well, what if? Like, well, why? That's interesting. Like wolves cycle with moons, and so do cisgendered menstruators. So why wouldn't, or any menstruators, so why wouldn't, along with the full moon and her blood, come this ability to become the werewolf's predator? What a great idea. Like, I didn't start with like, I want to write a book that interrogates patriarchy and rape culture. If I had, I would have would have written kind of a preachy kind of lesson down story, and those are the worst. Like if you have a lesson you want to tell someone, just tell them the lesson and save them the 300 pages, you know? My job as a writer is to tell story. And so I thought, what a rad story. I can't wait to, and I always thought to myself, like, that must exist already. It's too perfect. So I went back to our hotel room and I started Googling like menstruating werewolf hunter. And nothing, I couldn't find it. And so didn't exist yet. So then I knew I had to write it quickly because I was so sure that it was like such a brilliant idea that very soon there'd be 10 menstruating werewolf hunter full moon stories. And I couldn't believe my luck that it hadn't happened yet. So yeah, I try not to think about theme. As far as how do I balance my responsibility? I mean, I guess I don't, honestly. Like my job is to tell the best story I can and to transform my understanding of the teenage experience into art. It is the reader's job to take care of themselves. It is the reader's job to, if they get to something like me with Mein Kampf, talking about Jews being this race that needed to be exterminated. Hello, I'm a Jew. My family was nearly exterminated. You know, they tried. I got to parts that made me uncomfortable. Guess what? I was like, this, I don't like this. I'm going to close this, put it down and walk away. And later, maybe I'll return to it if I feel like I want to, which I did. So I think the writer's job is to create and the reader's job is to interrogate themselves and the work. It's one of the things that I really think is such a shame about, there's many things that are a shame about the banning, but no one told me I couldn't read books when I was a kid. I read books that I was confused by or overwhelmed by. And I learned to sort of notice like if I had an icky or sticky feeling and I didn't want to read it, no one was making me not read it. And also no one was making me read it. And so I could close it and put it away if I felt unsafe. And I just think what a great practice for consent that is. The practice to notice something in a situation that maybe doesn't feel great and then to leave the situation. And books are a safe and wonderful place to practice feeling uncomfortable and to practice saying no. A practice that I think many young people could benefit from having on the page or in the privacy of their own rooms before they get to a physical situation in the world where maybe they don't know that they can say no. So I don't think about the reader that much, but I hope that the reader does. I hope the reader thinks about themselves and chooses to opt out. I have people tell me, I started to read your book, but I thought it was really weird and gross, and so I didn't finish it. I say, great, that's awesome. Maybe you'll come back to it someday, maybe you won't, you know. I'm so glad you listened to yourself.
Have you ever had a reader, maybe at a school visit, share how your books helped them through a difficult time?
Yeah.
Is there a particular story that stands out to you the most?
So what's interesting to me is I have two sort of tracks, I guess, of my writing self. I have my young adult work that you talked about, and then I have these sweet, loving explorations of what it means to be a person for younger readers. I have a series called A Boy Called Bat about an autistic kid who befriends an orphan skunk. I myself am also autistic. I have a number of picture books. I have a series about a little girl named Harriet. So as far as school visits, for example, go, though, what's really interesting to me is that even though almost all the awards I've won have been for my young adult books, I have never once been invited to speak at a high school. I've never been invited to a school visit. So all my school visit invitations are for my younger books, most often for A Boy Called Bat, which gets used as a one school, one book read. And you look like that's surprising, but it's really not surprising, right? Like my YA books are kind of the ones that are sort of, I guess, kind of subversive and the ones that are maybe, you know, discovered, hopefully, if they're on the shelf, that a kid just stumbles onto and they pick it up and they're like, that sounds interesting. And they take it home and they read it, but they're probably not going to be taught in an 11th grade English class for the most part, unless it's a very liberal, very forward thinking, probably private school where all the parents know that they're going to be talking about that sort of thing. Which is why it's so terribly problematic when my books get taken off bookshelves in libraries, school libraries, and public libraries, because then no kid is going to stumble across it. And once they're holding it, realize it's the book they needed, you know? Since it's my books, my YA novels are not going to be taught to people in schools. I have had people reach out to me through email after reading my books. I've had teens and young adults write to me and tell me that they had no idea what gaslighting was or that they were being gaslit until they read Damsel, and they didn't know they were in an abusive relationship until they read that book. So that is obviously, you know, incredibly meaningful to me. Books. I have a lot of parents who reach out to me about A Boy Called Bat and tell me that they didn't, they didn't understand their autistic kid very well until they read that book. I had one teacher write to me and tell me that she'd read A Boy Called Bat to her class, and at the end of the book, one of the kids asked if he could borrow the book and take it home. And this kid she knew was autistic. He had an autism diagnosis. The teacher knew and the parents knew, but they hadn't told this fourth grader. And he took the book home and he gave it to his parents and he said, "This is me." And it opened up a conversation between the parents and the kid. And they're like, actually, it's past time we told you, actually, yes, you've been diagnosed as autistic, and this is some of the things that that means. And this is why you get some extra help after school. So I'm always sort of delighted and amazed when any reader reaches out to me to tell me that, my book has been meaningful to them. I write the books and they go out into the world and my brain is turned on to the next thing that I'm working on. I'm very sort of insular in my creativity. So whenever someone writes to me to tell me that they found my books to be meaningful to them for any reason, I'm thrilled, and I'm always sort of surprised to hear that my work is out there meeting readers. Yeah, I think if someone reads one of my books and it helps them to know themselves better, like that's a huge honor to me. And it more than anything else, though, it also means that they see me in them, right? Because my books are so about me that when someone says, I know more myself because of what I read, I feel like this human connection. I was a very sort of isolated and lonely kid. I didn't have friends really, and I didn't have parents who were present for me. I had my wonderful grandmother that I got to see on weekends and my grandfather and in the summer. But most of my time I felt sort of like lonely and lost and confused and like hiding in books because I didn't really know how to do the thing to make friends socially. And a lot of my time with adults was, sort of icky men being gross with me because I was sort of a loner and awkward and sort of an easy prey. And so my books have always been sort of a way of me sorting out what I think it means to be human. And so when someone else says that they see themselves or learn something about themselves, it's like I've made a friend in the world, They see themselves, but they're seeing me in themselves. And so that is kind of a lovely surprise.
Some stories carve their way into our hearts, not with ease, but with urgency. Elana K. Arnold reminds us that literature doesn't have to be gentle to be necessary. Through her unflinching honesty and fierce empathy, her books give voice to those who are so often unheard. Girls discovering their power, teens navigating darkness, and readers searching for truth. Elena, thank you for showing that all stories can be tender and sharp all at once.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And I do hope that boys and young men will read my work too. And I'm glad to hear that you have that. Stories about girls are for everyone.